The story is told of a young, accident-prone American pilot. Everything the young man did always seemed to go wrong. He was stationed aboard an aircraft carrier during World War II, and there was considerable doubt whether this fellow would be allowed to fly, since no one knew what might happen. One particular day, he was given a mission, and everything seemed to be going his way. He spotted and sunk a Japanese warship. Then he shot down several Japanese Zeros. Out of ammunition and nearly out of fuel, the pilot was trying to return to his aircraft carrier, but he couldn't locate it. Suddenly the clouds opened up. There below him was an aircraft carrier. For once his landing was flawless. With the plane secured, he jumped out and rushed up to the commanding officer, eager to share the details of his successful mission. He reported he had sunk a Japanese warship and downed several fighters, to which the commander responded, "Also." His successful mission ended with his flawless landing on a Japanese aircraft carrier. What would have been good news on an American carrier certainly wasn't on an enemy carrier. In a children's story, Mrs. Frog would go about asking other mothers what they fed their babies. She would ask one animal and then another. Finally, she came upon a snake, and she said to it, "Mrs. Snake, what do you feed your babies?" Mrs. Snake responded, "I feed my babies wide-mouthed frogs." Mrs. Frog replied, "Oh, is that so?" You did get the close. Yeah. "Oh, is that so?" Sometimes we discover that our words aren't appropriate in a certain situation. Now, the man who reported King Saul's death to David discovered this, and much to his downfall. We'll be looking at 2 Samuel chapter 1 this evening. And we have the report of the king's death. After the death of Saul, we read, David returned from defeating the Amalekites. While he was there, a man came to him. The man was identified as an Amalekite. He identified himself as that. And he said, "I've escaped from the Israelite camp." David said, "Well, what happened? Tell me." He said, "The men fled from the battle. Many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead." Then David said to the young man who brought him the report, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa," the young man said, "and there was Saul leaning on a spear, with the chariots and riders almost upon him. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me, and I said, 'What can I do?' He asked me, 'Who are you?' 'An Amalekite,' I answered. Then he said to me, 'Stand over me and kill me. I'm in the throes of death, but I'm still alive.' So I stood over him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen, he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord." This young man brings this report of Saul's death, and basically, I guess you could even say he was bragging a bit. "I took Saul's life." Now, why would he brag to David that he had killed Saul? Well, Saul had been out to get David for some time. There was a friction between them on Saul's part. There's just one problem, one big problem with what this young man reported to David. His story was a deliberate lie. His purpose was to convince David that he wanted him to be Israel's next king and to gain himself a respectable position in his army or government. What actually happened is recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 31. In my Bible, that's just across on the next page. And I believe originally 1 and 2 Samuel were one book. But if you read from 1 Samuel chapter 31, you find out that it's a far different story than what this young Amalekite told. It turns out that Saul wanted his armor bearer to go ahead and kill him. And the armor bearer would not do that. And so Saul took his own life. And then the armor bearer, being loyal to Saul, took his own life. And so it was a far different story than what the Amalekite told. Now, why did the Amalekite make up such a story? He thought he would get favor from David. He didn't know David very well. Over in 2 Samuel chapter 4, verse 10, David has some words that reflect back on what had happened on that occasion. We'll start back with verse 9. David answered Rechab and his brother Baanah, the sons of Rimmon the Beerahite, "As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of all trouble. When a man told me Saul is dead and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and put him to death in Ziklag. That was the reward I gave him for his news." David was not happy to hear that Saul was dead. He certainly was not happy that this young man claimed that he had put him to death. In fact, David immediately ordered, "Strike this man down." Put him to death, which was done. Now, we have heard the phrase, "the enemy of your enemy is your friend." Well, in truth, the enemy of your enemy has his own interest and not yours, or God's interest at heart. The saying, "he who lies for you will lie to you," is more accurate. David and his men lamented the loss of their king, but apparently this Amalekite, who was the son of an Amalekite, resident alien in Judah, had no regard for the king's adopted family, or the adopted king's family, his adopted king's army, or his adopted people's welfare. Yes, when the Amalekite approached, he tore his clothes, he sprinkled ashes on his head, indicating his sorrow. But he did not shed a tear when David and his men went the village with their tears. Not even crocodile tears, or as the Chinese say, cat tears for a mouse. This man was put to death because he lied. He did not understand David's respect for Saul as king. And so we see then the reaction to the king's death. David was Saul's enemy. That's pointed out in several texts in 1 Samuel. But Saul was never his enemy. David loved Saul, but Saul hated him. David called himself Saul's servant 5 times. He did not rejoice when his king died. Saul's problem was with him, and his vendetta was against David. It was not against the people, not with David's men. Saul had a problem with David, and he sought to kill David a number of times. You may recall that David had an opportunity to kill him. He says, "No, I'm not going to kill the Lord's anointed." Saul was basically a good king. He, as we saw, I believe it was last Sunday, was a disobedient king, which brought about the end of his dynasty. But he had ruled the people well, done good things for them. And no matter what Saul did to David, David would not rejoice, especially over the circumstances of his death. David was never jealous, angry, or spiteful. What is our response to the suffering or death of an enemy? I think all of us at the moment probably have a very common enemy in mind who lives far, far away from here. We believe that if this man suddenly disappeared from the face of the earth, that things might improve. Maybe they would. But what is our attitude toward enemies? What did Jesus say our attitude should be? Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. It's interesting, we've seen reports in Ukraine that some of the Russian soldiers, when they've surrendered, have been approached by some of the women there in Ukraine. Everybody has a cell phone these days, apparently. And they've actually called up the mothers of these Russian soldiers and had the Russian soldier talk to their mother. That's pretty good treatment of somebody who has come in to attack your nation. It's said that a certain Duke of Milan was so hated for his unbearable cruelty that everybody prayed day and night for something bad to happen to him. Someone noticed that every day at sunrise, a decrepit old woman entered a church and prayed to God that he would give the Duke health and long life. The Duke, hearing about this and knowing very well that he did not deserve that for his virtue, sent for the old woman and asked her why she prayed to God for him every day. I admit, she said, that I have done this until now for good reasons. This is because I was, as a young girl, we had a very cruel Lord, and I wish that he should fall from power and die. Basically prayed for that to happen. After he died, he was succeeded by another who was no better than he. Wherefore I believe once more that it would be to our advantage if he were killed. Now you are our third Lord, and you are more wicked and cruel than the first two. I fear, therefore, that after your death you will be succeeded by someone worse than you are. And so I never stop praying to God to let you live for a long time. Well, the tyrant was too ashamed to put to death this little woman who was so bold. She realized that the enemies could get worse, but she was praying for this man. Harold Rafa, the best-selling author of the book, The Art and Science of Negotiation, was with a friend when he bought his morning paper from an old run-down newsstand. The counter, the paint, and the roof of the stand did not appeal to Rafa's friend. Neither did the owner, who was in a bad mood. Rafa left his money on the counter, interrupted his conversation with his friend, and greeted the owner. "Good morning, Sam." The owner, Sam, however, snarled back and walked back to the back of the stand. Rafa's friend, who was shaken by the owner's attitude, surprised at Howard's calm, asked, "What do you suppose is the matter?" Howard smiled and said, "This is actually one of his up days." "Well, how could you tell?" the friend again asked. Rafa noted, "He had a special spring in his step today." His friend wondered, "How long have you been coming to this newsstand, Howard?" "About 10 years, Howard remembered. The friend asked this final question: "Why are you so nice to someone who is so unpleasant?" Howard turned to him and taught him an unforgettable lesson. Why should I let someone else determine my behavior? Now, we do have enemies. They hate us. But how we respond to them is an indication of whether they control us or not. Why should we let someone else determine our attitude, our way of thinking? Yes, Saul hated David. He wanted to get rid of him. He tried to get rid of him. David's response was much different. What is the response of David to Saul's death? In the latter part of chapter 1 of 2 Samuel 1, we have a poetic section there where David expresses his grief. And what we see is not rejoicing, but sadness and respect. The theme of the lament is in verses 19, 25, and 27. How the mighty have fallen. The king of their nation has fallen. He has died. David calls upon Israel to appreciate what Saul had done for them. David reaffirms the mutual love between himself and Jonathan. Jonathan had also been killed in this battle. So David here had the right attitude. David is an interesting person to study. Yesterday, Debbie and I at the Affirming the Faith seminar heard an excellent presentation by Harold Schenck upon David. David had his problems. Well, let's just don't sugarcoat it. He had sins, committed a number of them. But he's called the man after God's own heart. And I think we see in his attitude towards Saul and to Saul's death a part of what gave him that distinction. How do we treat those who would mistreat us? How do we treat those who hate us, those who are our enemies? How do we treat others? In the summer of 2003, cyclist Lance Armstrong's attempt to equal Miguel Indurain's record of 5 successive Tour de France wins nearly came to a crashing halt. With 14 stages completed and 6 stages to go, Armstrong's lead was in jeopardy when he fell off his bicycle after the handlebars were clipped by a spectator's bag. Hot on Armstrong's heels was John Ulrich, the 1997 winner and 4-time Tour runner-up, who had the opportunity to slice into Armstrong's small lead of 15 seconds over him at the day's start. But to the gasp and admirations of the crowd, Ulrich did a most shocking and unselfish thing when Armstrong tumbled. The German refused to speed off, but slowed down to allow the American to pick up and catch up. Ulrich observed an unwritten sportsmanship rule in cycling, and incidentally repaid an old debt to Armstrong. The two were involved in a similar incident in their 2001 duel, when Armstrong waited for his rival Ulrich to recover. Well, at the 3-week, 2,100 miles tour event, if a leader needs a bathroom break, the cyclist would slow down, make room, quit racing until the leader is back. Interesting rules of racing, bicycle racing. But Ulrich said, of course, I would wait. If I had won this race by taking advantage of someone's bad luck, then the race was not worth winning. I've never in my life attacked someone who had crashed. That's not the way I race. Here's David. He learns of Saul's death. A young man reports it, thinking it would be great news to David, but it's not. David mourns for his enemy. He gains the victory in the conflict.